Greetings. Thank you, everybody. Dr. Spoke, I appreciate you putting this conference together. It was a great panel and conversation that's taking place. Crystal did a great job moderating. My name is Ian Campbell. I am former chief of staff to a member of Congress on Capitol Hill. I've become a lobbyist for several foreign governments, particularly Africa, Latin America. And I have two amazing panelists that we're going to have tell a little bit about themselves. First, we're going to have a presentation. I don't see her here yet. Dr. Val, I know she asked a question. I'm not sure if she's was disconnected. Bring her back in. In the meantime, Dr. Harrison, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am currently a professional lecturer at the George Washington University, but I am a proud, very, very proud, three-time alum of Howard University, including from most recently the graduate certificate in international studies and a PhD in African studies. So it is a pleasure, as always, to be back home. Anytime home calls on me to come speak or do anything, I am always more than happy to come home and do what I can. And I see a few folks in the chat that know. I've achieved many degrees from Howard. I pretty much got there in 1995 and just stayed until 2019 because it did feel like home. And so I'm looking forward to being able to bring back some of the knowledge I gained at Howard to this conversation in this discussion today.
And speaking of that, we want to jump right in until Dr. Val shows up. Jump right in. We're going to be talking about the Africa Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the end of neo-colonialism, whether or not the African Free Trade Agreement will allow for Africa to stand on its own and gain its foothold in the global economy. So, Dr. Harrison, for right now, I'd like to have you go into your presentation.
Okay, like improvisation. I'm glad I also happen to have an acting degree. So, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So on this question of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and whether or not it could be the end of neocolonialism, what I'll start with is the first half of the title regarding this panel, and that's the Africa Agenda 2063. Now, within the Africa Agenda 2063, it is a set of 7 aspirations regarding the goals and priority areas that the African Union has set for moving forward with where they want the African continent to be as a whole by the year 2063. And within those aspirations, the last 2 are the ones that are directly relevant to our conversation here today. The first one is priority area number 7. That is an Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. That's where the African Continental Free Trade Area comes into play. The African Continental Free Trade Area was envisioned in 2018 by the African Union, and they began to set things in motion in order to create a unified trading area within the continent in order to improve and foster trade between African nations, intra-trade, intra-continental development by Africans within the continent of Africa. But then there are some other things that are questions, I guess, that are raised in terms of what does that really mean and what does that look like? And that's how we get to the second half of the title for this panel, the end of neocolonialism. On its face, it sounds like the African Continental Free Trade Area could be the beginning of the end of neo-colonialism. And for those of you who are new to the idea of neo-colonialism and what that means, it's another way that colonization of the African continent continued even after African countries gained their independence. So how did that happen? If the Western nations left the continent and African nations began to lead their own countries and control their own countries, how is colonialism still there? Well, colonialism has continued due in large part to the financial arrangements between the former colonizing countries of the West and the US, through loans, through aid, through bilateral agreements, through investment programs when it comes to developing infrastructure. But one of the biggest things that has continued, that has allowed colonialism to continue, is the fact that Africa, during colonization, began exporting its raw materials, minerals, and not producing goods for itself. After the colonizers left, that did not change. Africa continues to be an export continent, an exporter of raw materials that go elsewhere outside of the continent, primarily to Western nations that have industrialization and development in their countries, with the capacity to turn those raw materials into goods that then are imported back into the African continent for consumption. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has area, and the agreement that goes with it has the potential to begin to shift that. And so what I want to pose is some questions about what that could really mean in terms of the end of neocolonialism. In order for it to really be the end of neocolonialism, there are several things that I think are important. And that brings me to the second area, a priority area of Agenda 2063 that's relevant to this panel. And that's item number 6. An Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential offered by African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. And so my perspective is that in order for the African Continental Free Trade Area to actually be successful and to be realized truly for the benefit of the African continent and to bring about the end of neocolonialism, we have to approach it from a human-centered perspective, meaning we have to put the people of the continent first. And that includes the least of these, as well as those who have the most. So first, I would like to say that one of the biggest issues that the continent faces right now that people talk about all the time is corruption, right? People talk about corruption and leaders and the elite lining their pockets based on various financial transactions and deals for development that keep themselves in power, but also keep themselves wealthy. So what we really need to make sure we focus on as the African Continental Free Trade Area moves forward is ensuring that the financial opportunities that come with it are for the benefit of all people, including those who are not currently in the elite. It cannot move forward with just a policy or processes set up that continue to enrich those who are already wealthy and those who are already in leadership and elites. We have to find ways in order to make sure that there are opportunities created to develop entrepreneurship, to develop manufacturing, to develop industrialization on the continent through small businesses and the people on the ground. Small businesses, yes, most certainly do exist on the continent now, throughout the continent in all of the countries. A lot of it is in the informal sector, however, and what the African Continental Free Trade Area stands to do is to be able to help shift some of those in the informal sector into the formal sector and actually begin to improve the opportunities they have to begin producing goods that the continent needs. The other thing that we have to be careful about is while the African Continental Free Trade Area is going to open up the continent within itself to be able to exchange raw materials and manufactured goods, right now the continent doesn't have that kind of infrastructure in place. So then the question becomes is who's going to build the initial infrastructure? Is it going to be other multinational corporations from the outside initially coming in and financing and helping build infrastructure or not? Who is going to be responsible for taking care of those things so that the industrialized sector can begin to develop and grow and produce goods within the continent? And what will those contracts and agreements look like? Will they continue to include conditions like what we have seen throughout time since independence that have conditions that continue to benefit those outside of the continent rather than those inside of the continent? The other thing that I think is really important that we focus on is the idea of the fact that within the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the key components is the ability for people on the continent to be able to move freely in order to engage in trade, in order to engage in business deals. And right now, there are a number of people on the African continent who can move, who can travel, who can fly, who can move around the continent and engage in business deals. But a lot of the average people within the continent don't have the resources to be able to afford to fly or take a train, even from one country to another. We do see that when it comes to tourism, recently there was some data released that documented the fact that when it comes to tourism and vacationing, Africans vacation and tour within Africa more than anyone else. So Africans travel around the continent and engage in various types of activities. The African Continental Free Trade Area stands to be able to increase that type of mobility, increase that type of movement, but it has to be done in a way that also increases activity and movement for those who can afford it the least right now, so that everyone is built up, everyone is brought along in this process, and we don't see the African Continental Free Trade Area further divide the class, further stretch the class divisions that already exist on the continent, where the haves end up having even more and the have-nots continue to have even less. Because part of the issues that we see on the continent when it comes to conflict and food insecurity and things like that are related to root causes that have to do with poverty and joblessness and lack of opportunity. So in order for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to be successful and overcome neo-colonialism, it has to be done for the benefit of everyone. It has to be done from the perspective of humanity, from the ground up. And I'd like to read a very short sentence from a Howard professor in the African Studies Department named Dr. Wilfred David. He is an economist who spent his career at the World Bank, but he is also a professor in the African Studies, and he developed a book called The Humanitarian Development Paradigm. And one of the things he says here that is the core to effective development from a human-centered approach is that the achievement of authentic development depends on enhancement of total human welfare, or the overall quality of life, and not just preferred parts of it. So as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement moves forward, the key to success in overcoming neo-colonialism will be to focus on what the human individuals need at the least and at the most, and bring everyone along together so that the continent can develop holistically.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harrison. Really appreciate that summary you asked. A lot of pointed questions that we are going to be addressing in the question and answers, and dive into a little bit more deeply. So thank you for your great presentation. Dr. Val, thank you. We have, glad you were able to get connected. We got into the presentation. If you could just introduce yourself a little bit and then go into your presentation. I'd like to hear your viewpoints on the topic at hand. And thank you so much for your participation.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Campbell, and also Professor Lakeisha, and hello, distinguished ladies and gentlemen from around the globe. I thank you, Dr. Sepola, for inviting me to this very, very critical and very important event, the 25th Annual Women Ambassadors Conference. I'm delighted to join my esteemed panelists at this event. Now, quickly, the subject matter for me today is actually challenges and opportunities of female-owned small, medium enterprises in Africa within the framework of the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and COVID-19. I think I have about 12 minutes or so to do this, so I'll zip through as quickly as I can. Now, I have a slide which I'm hoping will show, so let me see if the shared screen shows. So quickly, within the framework, because the framework of what we're talking about today about women and youth-owned SMEs is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I'll give you a quick overview. And my esteemed panelist has already talked quite a bit about AFCFTA, so I won't go in depth. The AFCFTA was, it entered into force 2019. So far, it's been signed by 54 of the 55 African nations. 36 of them have ratified it. The goal is to promote intra-Africa trade in intra-Africa manufactured goods. And as my esteemed panelist mentioned, decolonization is very critical. The neo-colonial era is actually meant to promote, according to some, not everybody, to promote trade in goods, in other words, unfinished goods in Africa. So what the AFCFTA plans to do or aims to do is to actually promote goods from cradle to grave in finished products. When we say finished products, we mean manufactured primary products. Africa is very rich in natural resources, but so far with the neo-colonial era, they've been mostly benefiting and gaining a lot of revenue from exports, extractive industries. In other words, exporting primary products like cocoa, coffee, gold, oil in Nigeria, gold in Ghana, coffee and, cocoa in Ivory Coast and Ghana. So the list goes on. So you get the drift on the background. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area also capitalizes on 1.2 billion market and $2 trillion GDP. So quickly, in terms of statistics on SMEs, I don't think the slide is up yet, but that's fine. We can just, nope, it's not on. But anyway, I'll just forget the slide for now. So in terms of statistics on SMEs, meaning small medium enterprises, sometimes called the MSMEs for the smaller ones and the more vulnerable ones. So quickly, they're the backbone of Africa's economy, and SMEs, they hire about 80% of Africa's workforce. That's a high percentage. Now, most of them are in the informal sector, right? More than 50% of SMEs are in the informal sector and also in the services industry. And women comprise more than 50% of workers in that informal sector. Now, quickly, this raises a challenge of formalization. Now, on the question of fragility, when we talk about fragility, we're talking about businesses that are really small, feeding from hand to mouth, so to speak. Only 2% of entrepreneurs in Africa have 10 or more employees. That means that 98% of entrepreneurs in Africa actually hire more than 10. That raises a challenge of fragility and scaling up. When we talk about scaling up, we're talking about businesses that are so small they can't sustain themselves, really, especially within the framework of COVID now. And you can imagine women comprise a large percentage of that demographics. Also, SMEs contribute only 2% to GDP in Africa. Why? I mentioned earlier, formalization. Most of them are in the informal sector, so they exist pluralistically with government, right? They're not paying taxes. Government is not capturing their taxes, and women comprise a high percentage of that. Also, globally, women beyond Africa, really, there are 9.4 million female-owned SMEs in over 140 nations. But guess what? In Africa, 74% or more of women are involved in transboundary trade, not just along Rwanda border with DRC and Tanzania and Uganda in the eastern part of Africa, but this is also rampant in the western and southern part of Africa. And my slide, the first slide, I had a photo of those women. So hopefully the slide will come up at some point, maybe during Q&A. So quickly, the impact of AFCFTA and COVID on female-owned SMEs, too early really to determine, because as I said earlier, the AFCFTA came into effect 2019. But the good news is that the provisions, Article 3.5 of AFCFTA, that's the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and also Article 27 of the Protocol on Trade in Services, actually signal that the African member nations are actually very much interested in inclusivity, including women and youth. As my esteemed panelist mentioned, youth and women are very critical to this process, sustainability and growth in Africa. So they recognize the importance of that. Now, given that backdrop, what are what I call the 6 survival challenges that AFCFTA member nations should turn to opportunities? I'm going to give this as a laundry list, and during Q&A, we can dive a little bit if you have more questions. First, they must, or they should, I don't want to say must, they should. They should make sure that those SMEs that are in the informal sector formalize, incentivize them to formalize. How do they do this? Improve the ease of doing business. I'm actually on I'm a member of the Nigerian World Bank community, and they meet annually to discuss progress, especially with Nigeria, progress with ease of doing business. And the multilateral organizations and donors actually give a ranking on ease of doing business and how countries are doing. When we talk about ease of doing business, licensing fees for registering your business is one example of reducing the cost of it for women especially, and for people, informal sector. Second is technical skills. Okay, within the rubric of technical skills, what do we do? Strengthening women's ability, and youth, their ability to, operate their business with respect to technical, especially in the agribusiness sector. As we mentioned earlier, most African small, medium enterprises now, they manufacture products, for instance, tomatoes. Their tomatoes get rotten because it's perishable within a short space of time. They don't have the technical ability to sort of turn it into a finished product, like canning of tomatoes. The agribusiness sector needs to improve, and the manufacturing sector in many other ways. We'll discuss that during Q&A if you have more questions. We could do this too by using the cheetah generation here that go back, the entrepreneurs, what we call the cheetah, the young youth, to go back and train women, improving networks, joint ventures between SMEs and SMEs in the African diaspora here, the Afro-American diaspora, so to speak, helping them to strengthen their technical skills. 3, scaling up. I mentioned earlier about the 2% entrepreneurs have 10 or more, only 2%. So we need to scale up because they can capitalize on large economies of scale. In other words, if they're big, the bigger you are, the less fragile your business is. We could go into that during Q&A. Financial capacity is the one everybody talks about. It's always the common and most often cited challenge and solution. So I won't delve into that, but there are different types of financial, possibilities. In other words, fintech, factoring, money, helping them in different ways. Non-financial capacity, providing them with affordable, that's number 5, providing them with affordable infrastructure. To be able to run your business, you need good lights, electricity like I have here, and you need water. So the government needs to create an enabling environment for them to have access to affordable technology and affordable infrastructure, right? Also, the one that's my favorite, because I'm a lawyer, I'm a law and economist, is number 6, which is business, trade, legal, policy, knowledge, and skills. Because my company, Afro-Cosmo Development Impact, this is what we do for female-owned and youth SMEs in Africa. and here too. We help them to have access to business, legal, knowledge, trade facilitation. And with respect to this one in particular, very, very critical. There are different areas of business, be it business formation, helping them with knowing, okay, you can scale up. The woman I had in the photo, which I think it's not accessible yet. Oh, it is. Okay, maybe it is. Let me see. No, I don't see it. I don't see it yet. But anyway, the woman I had in the photo, she was selling plantains, fried plantains. The woman across the street was selling yam, and another woman across the street was selling water. And simple mergers and acquisitions, you could simplify it, because I worked in mergers and acquisitions, and just tell them, why don't you merge? You could actually be selling one, a meal for people. So if you merge, so that's mergers acquisitions. Going to a small scale farmer. Another example, she's having financial problems. If she has a relative in the city, you could tell her that's suretyship. Suretyship in law. You could teach her simplified version of suretyship, which is another area of law, which is you have a rich relative in the town. If you have a rich relative, that rich relative should stand. It could be your guarantor, right? Because they have a problem with credit worthiness, most of these small, medium enterprises. So those are just a few examples. There's also intellectual property rights. How did McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken get to how they became franchises? Because they first registered their food, as a trade secret. That's how it begins. So if you're a street hawker selling food, that's one way. So that's the area. It's similar to street law. For those of you who are in the audience, students, you will understand. Even those who are not students, you will understand the value of registering whatever you have, your knowledge, be it in public, if you're publishing something or if you're cooking a meal and it's very delicious and you want to sort of increase its value, you have to register it. So that's in the area of intellectual property. So so with that as a backdrop, let me end by concluding quickly that to achieve economic and industrial development goals, the AFCTA member nations must turn those aforementioned 6 challenges into opportunities. And let me also say that the COVID-19 lockdown has created challenges for those SMEs. They become even more vulnerable within the rubric of what has been going on. They're not able to go to the marketplaces and sell their products or whatever because of the lockdown. And also protectionist policies have also undermined their ability to operate because they don't have access to food supply coming in, or they're not able to export. But having said that, it has also created opportunity for government to create an enabling environment for them to be able to produce their goods and to be able to become more productive locally, so that they can zero in, almost like a forced protectionist policy that's imposed upon them. So it's also created that opportunity for government to make sure that they have, they're progressing and, becoming more productive. It's sort of like a survival of the fittest kind of strategy that the government is using. Now, last but not the least, I wanted to throw this out, but I'll answer it myself. The female-owned African micro, small, and medium enterprise trader, what's keeping them afloat? Very resilient. I call them the resilient survivalists. They continue to survive through thick and thin. And with that optimistic statement, I close my case and hand over to my fellow esteemed moderator, Ian.
Thank you so much, Dr. Val. I'm glad you were able to fit all that in. And if your slide is not working, I don't think I'm going to have my slideshow present out as well. So I'm going to give it a shot. I think the questions that's being raised are going to be in line with the topic, simply because individuals are living and experiencing this process right now and looking to see how they can take advantage of the solutions that we are exploring and looking to bring to the table. So with that being said, I'm going to start my presentation. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have the slide either, but I start off with just identifying the sheer size of Africa. And one thing that we've been miseducated with here in the States is we don't understand the huge, significant land mass that the continent has. And it can fit the United States, China, Spain, Japan. The size of Africa is tremendous, and the economy potential of Africa is tremendous as well. And getting to that point, understand the resources that are there. There's diamonds, gold, coffee, copper, crude oil, uranium. Every mineral that you can think of, natural gas, iron ore, is on the continent. So we have to understand what we're dealing with, and walking into a free trade area is to appreciate what's been done before and take lessons from, I would say, AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. There are significant developmental challenges in Africa. Based on the Congressional Research Services, Africa economic issues happen to be the poorest region on the per capita basis. The legacy of apartheid impact land and wealth inequalities. We still have a history and legacy of slave and colonial rule still impact the development of economic issues today. There's a lack of electricity that was just touched on by Dr. Val. You cannot really have development if you don't have access to electricity. Only 43% of the continent, people on the continent, have access to current and regular use of electricity. The AFCT FTA provides non-tariff barriers and other impediments. It reduces some of those challenges. It has to do with the political instability and uncertainty that is currently taking place on many parts of the continent. Regulatory and legal environments that we discussed need to be in place, and that's part of one of the questions that we have. What protections can be developed? How can the regulatory environment be suitable for investment, development, infrastructure growth? The economic complexities. You're dealing with different markets side by side each other, different currencies and things of that sort. So how do we deal with the complexities of working together to create a streamlined process so everybody can understand what the rule is and the rules of the game? Lack of infrastructure is going to be a challenge, as was discussed. We need to know how infrastructure is going to be brought up to speed so that Africa can compete fairly. One of the lack we saw in the AGOA, Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, there was not a significant investment for infrastructure. It was more so about trade, just being able to move the raw materials, which is not the best process for development, and it's not sustainable. The African Union officially launched in 2002 when it was created and is pushing the issue of moving from aid to trade. Dr. Arikana Chiyombori Kwao, who was the previous African Union ambassador, was very adamant about addressing neocolonialism and some of the remnants of impact that that's had on the continent, particularly with the currency, the relationship, travel, all restrictions. And she's no longer with the African Union, but she still continues to advocate for the improvement of the continent and different countries thereof. Kwame Nkrumah said the essence of neocolonialism is that the state of which is subjected to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. That's the challenge that Africa is facing, dealing with being influenced by outside forces and attempting to be independent of those forces. So that has been a challenge for going back to independence. In Agenda 2063, Africa's Blueprint, Master Plan for Transforming Africa into a Global Powerhouse of the Future, we have to deal with the unity of the continent being pushed from the manifestation of Pan-Africanism, a self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity pursued under a African Renaissance. Africa Agenda 2063 is a repositioning Africa to become a dominant player in the global arena. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, the precursor, the model, the learning from the best practices, and how did AGOA benefit the continent but did not provide for the benefit of the continent, is two very separate things. It it was improved the long-term extension of AGOA recently, several years ago under the 2014 when AGOA was being renewed. A lot of conversations about development of the continent was brought up. There weren't a lot of fixes. So it was an extension of the AGOA preferences and act. The General Accounting Office, General Government Accountability Office did a research that brought data to analyze how AGOA actually benefited the continent, but it was more so beneficial to the United States for trade and development. There was a significant windfall on the U.S. side, even though there was growth in Africa. The number of countries that have benefited, about 39 countries have benefited from AGOA. They still did not grow to the level of being able to build factories and create manufacturing and things of that sort. So that is what needs to be addressed as we reshape or look into the AFCTCA, FTA. The former assistant U.S. Trade Representative and now current CEO of Corporate Council in Africa, Florizel Lazier, when she testified before Congress, she said there's a challenge for both the United States and AGOA and other beneficiary countries. We cannot ignore, exclude the Europeans and Asians, other countries that is vying for positioning and the right to be in Africa. AGOA's effectiveness was currently have been under reviewed in essence to promote trade in the sub-Saharan Africa. The current administration, the previous administration, 116th Congress, shied away from continuing business as usual. And the current administration is looking into how do we create a relationship with the Africa that will allow for the U.S. to benefit, but yet still provide benefit to the continent while dealing with the new environment that they've inherited, the passage of the AFCTFTA. So that, I would say, conundrum is being worked out because when trade takes place, it usually benefits the larger economy. Typically is the beneficiary of such trade policies. To deal with the issue of how some of the beneficiaries of the trade agreement, the UN identified that their world population would hit about 10 billion people by 2055 in the continent. Most of the folks are going to be under the age of 25. Right now, 16 million young people are facing unemployment. On average of 11 million young people join the African labor market, but only 3.7 million jobs are created annually. There's a tremendous gap that we have to address. And the Africa Free Trade Agreement have to be able to develop industries, support informal industries, bring those informal businesses provide the resources to bring them into the formal economy so that we can bridge the shortfall and the gap between those individuals and groups. The power of women and Africa's development as it relates to the AFCTA, the informal economy, and development and growth of Africa is key, because right now women represent half the population of Africa. Women are considered internationally as one of the main pillars of economic development, but they suffer unjustly with pay, market equality, gender, social restrictions. The challenges to development and growth has to be paralleled with the development and growth of the woman, the family, which leads to the growth of the economy. There are ways to contribute to improving the socioeconomic status of women in Africa through economic empowerment, and we're looking at those ways, as Dr. Val just highlighted or touched on, to make sure that this informal economy is brought into the formal economy, and we can help to raise the level of cost of living in those communities, in those countries across the continent. One of the things that is not really touched on is the impact the diaspora have on the continent. The African Union has a 6th region, and it's bringing in the diaspora as part of the African Union. We have diaspora initiatives in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Egypt, and elsewhere. There are also organizations such as Yadi or Mindflix Media that is tapping into the diaspora to bring that focus and attention for investors, for entrepreneurs to the continent. Ghana, in the year of return 2019, did a great job bringing almost 1 million visitors and 1.9 billion revenue to the continent as part of its diaspora initiative. The 6-region diaspora initiative tied in partnership with the free trade agreement, dealing with individuals on the ground, doing women-to-women businesses and youth entrepreneur seminars and summits and business opportunities can lead to that groundswell, that grassroots, grass top growth that we need, that will eventually lead to the change of individuals in the leadership, in the presidency, and the minister's office to understand the impact that they have on bringing in diaspora and tapping into the informal society community. According to the president, again, of this Corporate Council in Africa, U.S. free trade will be positively impacted by the AFCFTA. The U.S. is looking out for their best interests. We just had a U.S. and a AU joint statement that was signed in 2019 prior to the pandemic, and how that has had to slow the initiation of the agreement. But it's as of January, we know it's currently in force. The 117th Congress is looking towards policies that's going to provide the assistance necessary to balance that relationship between the United States and Africa, balance that trade relationship, the not allowing Africa to fall victim of being picked off, singled out by country, but holding together and moving as more of a block will allow for the continent to be able to compete more equitably versus China, versus the US, Russia, and elsewhere. Simply because the infrastructure is just not there, and the resources are just not there to compete on par with other big moving economies. As Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso for 4 years in the 1980s, famously argued, debt is neo-colonialism, in which colonizers transform themselves into technical assistants, we should say technical assassins. The Paris Club is there. Let's create the Addis Ababa Club for canceling our foreign debt. Our club should say our debt will not be paid. Sankara's advice was not heeded, and throughout the 80s, indebted African countries had to surrender their autonomy to structural adjustment programs. I'd like to thank you for your attention. We're going to go into a question and answer and discuss some of the points we all touched upon. And, Dr. Harrison, I want to go back to you. You touched on a number of points in reference to just the youth, women, the policies have to be people driven. And after you highlight, how do we emphasize and get those at the top to understand that? And Dr. Val, you could follow up with a question that was asked from those youth and people in informal sectors. How do we make sure that they're given the assistance and it's protected? They're given they can get access to the resources, the funding, the legal framework that they need to be able to jumpstart their business and be part of the mainstream society. Dr. Harrison?
Thank you for that. And that is a loaded question. If I had the answer to that question, I think we would already see some differences on the continent, even without the African Continental Free Trade Area. That's a question that even goes beyond Africa, that has to do with just human beings and the way we privilege, the way we marginalize people economically, and understanding how to get those in leadership and the elites to understand the importance of opening up opportunities for the least of these in society, as opposed to necessarily hoarding more wealth and opportunity for themselves. I think there is something unique about the African continent and African culture as a whole writ large, not making an overgeneralization, but an understanding about common cultural connections across the continent, a lot of alliteration there, is returning back to and reclaiming African understandings about community. As a whole, African culture was never centered on the individual, and I get mine, you get yours. African culture, prior to Western intervention, was centered on developing and working within a communal context for the best of all of those involved. So that if I have something and you do not, and I see that you are doing the best that you can, it is part of my obligation as your brother, as your sister, as your mother, as your father, auntie, cousin, or just your kinsperson to do what I can to try to help you. Because when I know that you prosper collectively, then the whole community, the whole village, the whole region prospers, because we are all better together. And that is a very African concept that we have not completely lost as a people, not just in the diaspora, I'm talking about on the African continent. We have not lost that, but it gets marginalized and sometimes warped and distorted. And sometimes we forget it. And I think when it comes to the African continental free trade area, that is one step in reclaiming that culture, because that is what the AFCFTA is about, is saying we're going to work together as a continent economically. The next step, though, in that is for those who are in positions of power, either politically or financially, to understand that that also needs to work from the bottom up, so that we're not just collectively coming together in a circle around the African continent. We also need to close that gap and do it in a spherical way. We need to do it from the bottom up and from the outside in, and remind ourselves that the idea of Ubuntu, the idea of I am because we are, is not just a catchy phrase to say. It is a way of life, and our ancestors understood that. And a key to making the AFCFTA successful for all people, including the least of these, is to actually live that out in policy. That's the best that I can do beyond going through a deep analysis of all of the complications for why that's a hard question to answer in 60 seconds. But I think that's a good place to start, is not just to talk about collective responsibility for one another as a talking point, but to actually live it through policy development, live it through the contracts and agreements, live it through the regulatory schemes that are developed within the countries. I mean, if we do not actually put it into the policies, the laws, and the financial opportunities that are available to everyone, then we're not going to see it happen.
But Dr. Val, you're on mute. Go ahead. There you go.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So the question was, how do we make sure that those in the informal sector become formalized?
While you do that, I just want to add one more piece to the conversation. I believe both of you talked about corruption, and that's always the number one topic that comes up when we talk about Africa, why Africa cannot move forward because of corruption. And in the years of being on the continent and working with Africa, one thing I've come to learn is I've learned that they learned corruption from the European colonizers that came there and taught them how to do business that way. So the way that they're acting, the way they're doing business is what was taught to them through how they do business with the folks who came and brought their level of corruption onto the scene. So if that could be a question that is, or a part of the conversation reference to corruption, was like, oh, I can't do business in Africa because it's so corrupt. That's just the policies. That's their informal policy that was been created by how to do business. You have to make sure everybody's palm is greased. You have to make sure that things are moving a certain way. You have to, So how do we address the issue of even when you do have a standard way of doing business, there's still outside ways to get things done. So how do we put that in the context of Dr. Val, the informal business, registering your business, getting things done the right way, protected, becoming part of the formal society, and dealing with the challenges of doing it all?
Yes, good question. On the issue of informal to formal, that's one of the things that Afro-Cosmo Development Impact LLC, Maryland, USA, that's one of the things that we do. But let me say that it's a matter of sensitizing both sides of the aisle, the stakeholders, meaning the SMEs, female and youth-owned SMEs in the informal sector, and the government, the regulators, and the policy implementers about the mutual gain of formalization. On the government side, the gain, remember we talked about the fact that government only captures 2% of GDP. SMEs only contribute 2% of GDP in most African nations. So the government is not able to capture revenues from that sector. So it's to the benefit of the government. Let me give an example of the food supply chain, which is what I work in, from cradle to grave. Cradle meaning the farmers, to grave meaning the food retailers, the street hawkers, sort of like the halal style truck. That's what we're proposing now for governments. We're trying to run training programs. Why? Because one of the benefits of making sure that government is aware that, listen, it's to your benefit if you create an enabling. Unfortunately, I couldn't show my slide, but the informal sector woman that I took that photo a year and a half ago, just before COVID started, I went to the scene in Lekki, Victoria Island, the street hawker, the informal sector woman. Where she is, it's very, very unsafe for her in terms of health and safety standards, number one. Two, it's not like the halal style truck that government provides in New York, that by the way the truck costs $20,000 as opposed to opening, I did the research on that, as opposed to opening up a restaurant for $500,000 in New York. Why can't we have that in the streets of Africa, right? Most of them do not have access to affordable infrastructure, as we all rightly discussed earlier, but they don't even have access to maybe good parking spots, good trucks with fans, healthy, safe environments where they can operate. They're going to work and they're being raped on their way to work and back, and then, actually it's illegal to be a street hawker now in Africa because of aesthetic beauty. The government had good intentions of protecting them because sometimes they're on street corners and cars are hitting them or people are raping them at night and all that. But you could do it in a very good way where you could create that enabling environment for them to be able to operate and get taxes. You could charge them for parking on, and maybe, rent out trucks like the halal. I keep talking about halal style trucks. I've been talking to them. This is what we're doing right now, trying to sensitize government to the value of encouraging them, incentivizing them to formalize. Why would you want to formalize if you're going to be overtaxed or overburdened with your small business that's already fragile? So the best way to do it, you can catch a bee with honey, is to offer them maybe, meager fees, to charge them meager fees so that they can have maybe trucks, have a fan, sell their products. That lady in the photo I had, she was selling. I was there for 1 hour watching her. She sold a lot of stuff. Even bankers were coming to her on street corner to buy her food, and she was stuffing it in her bra. She was in a very unhealthy environment. I'm telling you, these people, and now with COVID, they're not even able to move around. So why don't you do that? Rent out trucks. That's a benefit to the government. And on that side, you could train them, teach them how to scale up, to merge with others, because when you're operating, and another thing is dealing with the trust. We Black folk, we don't trust each other. Bill Gates, for crying out loud, started in his garage. He was a one-man business. That's how businesses grow and blossom. Mergers, acquisitions. I worked in M&A years ago. It's just simple business stuff, And, you look at Heinz, Elizabeth, what's her name? Teresa Heinz has just registered a trade secret for jollof rice, African jollof rice. It sells here in little packs. I mean, we're sitting there. I mean, we have to value our knowledge. We have to value, you know what I mean? So it's about sensitizing them to the value of this. That's what will encourage them to formalize. Nobody wants to formalize if they think the government will overtax them and overburden them with nothing in return. It's a quid pro quo. And on corruption, I agree with you. That's another subject matter. It's the whole conference for us to talk about corruption. But that is putting it, but interestingly enough, when you link corruption to aid, the fact that we're not holding our governments accountable, Africans are not holding their governments accountable because they're not paying taxes. See, there's a whole regulatory, for us who are law and economists, behavioral economists, there's a link to that. Look here, if we had a Biden answering to somebody in Lagos in elections and he's not running around restaurants and talking to his constituents, why wouldn't he be corrupt to a certain extent? And why would I, as a lazy consumer or voter who doesn't pay taxes, why would I even care about what my politician is doing if I don't pay taxes? It's almost like, the political system runs like a corporation. If you're a voter and you don't pay any taxes, why do you care? Your money is not in the political system. So why should you? Because most of the aid money is coming from here. I worked at the World Bank, so I'm not saying that aid is not good. There's a role for aid to play, but we have to be able to make sure that the system of transparency and accountability and social contract is not breached in the process. I think
this might be our last question. This for both of you. As we're talking about the diaspora, and we're talking about aid, partnership, there's a lot of people traveling to the continent to repatriate, to do business, to vacation, what have you. And they want to connect with the small businesses. They want to invest. They want to be part of the retirement plan for their future. They want to be part of the growth and development of Africa. They want to take advantage of the opportunities. How are building on the model of what Ghana did the year of return 2019? How can we expand upon that so that the youth that's coming of age is, growing at a rapid rate, women, small business, informal sectors, how can the average person here connect to the person on the ground? And how can we be sure that our investment is not going to go to waste and build those relationships and make sure that we are part of the reason why the FCTA is going to be successful, part of the reasons why Africa is getting away from neo-colonialism, be part of the reason why there's development and growth, and not add to the further degradation of our society and pushing it further down the rabbit hole.
So I'll start in a very general sense, just kind of the way we've been tag teaming in this panel so far is general and then specific. First of all is those of us who, since this is a student-focused event, students travel abroad, study abroad, take advantage of there are a number of study abroad programs that Howard University has in various schools. Study abroad. And I don't just mean go take a trip for a week or two, go do some sort of study abroad program for a month, 6 weeks, a semester, because in the process of going to the continent of Africa and studying, you will develop friendships and relationships with people on the ground there. You will learn more about the culture and the actual specific financial or legal or governmental systems in that country by living there for a month, 6 weeks, 6 months, etc. That is very critical because once you do that, then it makes it easier for you to also be able to learn culture, to learn how to discern who's legitimate, who's not in the process. And over time, if you maintain those relationships expand. And then when you're finished with school and you actually have a career or you have a job or you have resources and means, then you have relationships you can already call on to begin working on trying to figure out where can I send my resources or who can I partner with in order to help develop business opportunities or partnerships or what have you with other people who I've met and developed relationships over the years. And if not not them, then they can tell you who you can trust and who they can connect you with. It's all about building relationships. For those who are not in school who are listening, do the same thing from a professional standpoint. Travel. Go to the continent, even if it is for vacation, but in the process of doing so, intentionally seek out and learn more about the economic sectors there and different opportunities. Additionally, for anybody who's in school or out of school, there are a number of diasporic organizations that are out there that exist, that are designed purposely in order to connect people across the diaspora, but specifically to the African continent. And I'll start with two examples. One is a social media, there's a brand new social media outlet called Social Africa that just started. It was started by an African man who was a medical doctor, but who saw what was happening with Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., and realized that there wasn't anything like that for African people, and that African people should develop their own platform based on the best of what all of these have to offer in order to connect with one another, not just socially, but even for business opportunities. Join Social Africa and use that as an opportunity to begin to connect with people across the continent who you might not ever meet because you don't have access to them, because Facebook is monstrous. Instagram is monstrous, but Social Africa is specifically for Africa. Check it out. It's brand new. It's still somewhat in the beta stage, but it's not in the alpha stage, meaning it's launched, but it is growing. Use that as an opportunity to network. Beyond Social Africa, use LinkedIn. Connect with people of African descent on LinkedIn who are focused on African issues. And then another one that I'll make mention of, because Ian, you brought her up and she's probably in queue waiting to talk because
can I please interject on that so that I can add to the question before you?
Well, yeah, no, I was going to say
so in terms of additional
the African Diaspora Development Institute is another opportunity for people to engage, and it is specifically targeted at pulling the diaspora together for the purpose of trying to invest and develop the continent of Africa. And that was started by Dr. Arikana Chiambori-Kwao, the former African Union ambassador to the US, whom Ian mentioned earlier in the panel.
Okay. Thank you, my esteemed fellow panelists. Can I just add one or two to what you've said? I think you've touched on basically most of the important areas that they need to, or connections that they need to have. But I want to add that the AFCFTA Secretariat, actually, I discussed with one of the, he's the coordinator who was on my panel. He was actually my co-moderator 2 days ago when my company had a meeting, an SME event. We were talking about this, and it's very critical. The AFCFTA Secretariat in Ghana is actually looking to have a department that handles the diaspora network. So when they set it up, because it just became operationalized in January 2021, because of COVID, it was delayed. So they're working on it right now. So that's a very good question. So contacting them might be one way, to when they set it up, that might be. Also the embassies. Don't hesitate, because sometimes going through social media, what we call in Nigeria, the 419, there are many fake fraud people. So, as my esteemed panelists mentioned, traveling is good because then you see for yourself. If you go through in the internet, there are all kinds of people who claim to be what they're not. So if you have friends, make friends while you're there at Howard University, make friends with fellow Africans from wherever they're from, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and all. That way you can use that as a stepping stone or building block to have networks in their respective countries. Also the embassies, like I mentioned, and as my esteemed panelist mentioned, Sister Arikana, I call her Sister Arikana, she has a network too. My company does that. So you can always get my information from online. That's one of the things that Afro-Cosmo Development Impact does. We connect SMEs here with SMEs in Africa. And also AGOA, I think my esteemed moderator mentioned AGOA, I think, and FTA, Ian mentioned it. I think, Ian, you did, right? I don't know, yeah. But AGOA has hubs. Now, I think they had a hub in Ghana, a trade hub. They have one in South Africa, one in Kenya, and one in Nigeria. The one in Ghana, I think, moved to Nigeria, right? So you could probably tap into whatever, if you Google, you will see, and they could probably give you information on AFCFTA because they're going to be helping with the process. Even though AGOA expires in 2023, I suspect that it may be renewed, or they may be helping logistically the AFCFTA process in terms of domestication that's taking place in respective countries. Thank you.
Not sure if we have any more time, but I'd like to, if we do, talk about how, Dr. Harrison, you mentioned this about taking advantage of the study abroad program. And Dr. Val, you talked about talking to other folks from the continent who are here. So a lot of misconceptions that I've experienced is people from Africa, from the continent, think Black Americans don't like them. Black Americans have a negative perception of people from Africa. We just need to start talking to each other. We need to see somebody, hey, how you doing, where you from? You look like you're from Nigeria. Oh, you speak French? We just need to network and engage and tear down those walls. And somebody made a comment I want to comment to while we're on here before we go back to just having us come together. Just because we learned corruption from the Europeans does not mean we are allowing our leaders off the hook. They need to be held accountable for their actions. So I mentioned that just to say, it's not just in a vacuum. They learned it, it's learned behavior. They need to be accountable to their people for their responsibilities. So we're not letting them off the hook in no way, shape, or form. So just wanted to mention that, going back to, we just need to talk to each other. It's the strangest thing when you talk to somebody who's from the continent, look at you like, you're Black, and why are you talking to me? Then go, we probably related. So that's one thing that we don't do enough of.
It's the divide and conquer, because as Dr. Sefole smartly coined the topic of discussion today, the neo-colonization, the whole concept, and as I know Sister Arikana talks about the enslaved mind and the divide and conquer, it's all about us. We could be our worst enemy if really you want to, so we really need to move beyond that. It's not easy. Some people would argue it's because of the small pie. I don't even know why we perceive the pie as small. It's not really small. There's room for all of us, so, but, I'm optimistic, there are many, Sister Arikana is involving many people. I am in what I'm doing. The event I just had, my company had on Friday, which is online too, was Afro-Caribbean event. It was about promoting productivity in the SME industry in the Afro-Caribbean region. So it's, we all have to come together and get along, not to put down the Europeans, because there are many of them who are helping, but as the AFCFTA kicks in, Africa is ready for business. Africa is ready for, independence, economic empowerment. I know that word can be seen as whatever. So as you said, my brother, it's very critical that we start engaging with ourselves, but also engaging with, humans that are not Black. But, we know that we have historically been suppressed. So, we can't afford to really walk. We should be running right now in terms of the pace of economic development that's needed to bring us at the same level with where the so-called developed nations are, technologically, really. So it's about finding value in what we have, and appreciating what we have. It's very critical, But, one last thing, we're talking, my presentation was about SMEs, female-owned SMEs and youth. And I wish there will be a time when they will be at the table too, even with interpreters, because they are the ones, as we all said, as my esteemed panelist, Lakeisha said, and my esteemed moderator, Ian said, these people comprise majority of the informal sector. More than 60% of the informal sector in Africa is made up of female-owned SMEs, survivalist SMEs, what I call the survivalists, as opposed to the opportunist SMEs, who are the cheetah generation entrepreneurs who studied here and they're going back in the tech industry and all that. They're very few, and the very few that are like Dangotes, a lot of them are survivalists. They need help. Sometimes they're not at the table because they can't even speak English, but they're very good at what they're doing. And some of the bankers actually eat their food. They're like fast food in the streets. You know, they look left, right, they're wearing their suit, nobody's looking, they go and buy the food, you know. It may not be as hygienic, but they love it. And I used to eat that food when I lived in Nigeria years ago. I confess, you know, I'm guilty. But when I went back, my dad said to me, no, your immunity is too low now. You've lived in America for so long, 20 something years, you can't eat that food. I say, oh, it's so tasty, Daddy. He says, no, you can't. So really, it's about helping them, health and safety, improving employee health and safety, consumer health and safety, you know, for them to have a very sophisticated, nice environment with a fan, with infrastructure, with just the whole, like a halal truck. When I taught at GW, like my esteemed co-moderator, I teach now at Catholic, I had access to that. You know, the halal trucks even now are in Washington, DC, but there are many, and I love the food. It's clean, it's, you know, in a safe environment, and it's cheaper to set up. Why don't we have that in the streets of Kenya and Nigeria and all, you know? And most of them have been laid off because the government laid them off for aesthetic beauty and safety, and now they're turning to prostitution, there's domestic violence, it's crazy. So we need to bring them back into the system, like I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
I know that you've touched on this, Dr. Val. The question keeps coming up: how do we protect the indigenous women's knowledge, the local folks, the community that's not part of the mainstream? And we talk about the regulatory environment. We talk about making sure that they become part of the formal economy. We talk about protecting the interests of these informal workers. So I just want to reemphasize that for the audience, because that question continues to come up. And
I think one thing too, IP, intellectual property rights, is very critical, because if they're able to register, which is one of the things that we're doing, my company, trade secrets. I mentioned Teresa Hines, the wife of Kerry, you know, John Kerry. She has rights now to the jollof rice. You know, the jollof rice, it's all packaged and all. And we're sitting there, jollof rice. I mean, I don't want to say Nigerian jollof rice is better than Ghanaian before I get attacked, but African jollof rice is the best in the world, regardless of which country. You know that. I don't know if you've eaten it.
No, the pharmaceutical companies started that 30 years ago, at least. So it's been continuing,
Yes.
and it's in the informal society, in the informal sector, they don't have the money for IT, intellectual property protection. So that's where the diaspora may come in, or it might be micro loans or funding. The system, and I'm not sure if the agreement is going to or has yet thought about how to bring the resources to those individuals in the informal sector, because just like when they legalized marijuana here, everybody that should be having a marijuana shop can't afford to. So the major corporations and hedge funds jumped in and took advantage of it. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen? And how do we address the issue of like a diaspora free trade agreement with the Caribbean, Africa coming together to bridge an agreement with the diaspora and really make sure that everybody can take part in this trade that is now being made available? Any thoughts on that, Dr. Harrison?
I think when it comes, so I'm an attorney as well, and I actually was an attorney with the U.S. Trademark Office, so I'm very familiar with the idea of trade secrets and trademarks because I used to register them or deny them based on any number of reasons. But I want to go back to this issue of, even if we find a way to help these informal sector entrepreneurs register, then the other side of it is those who are in elite positions of power have to still respect it, because people violate trademarks all the time. And if you're in a position where you have a major corporation or you're in the elite within an African country and you see someone has developed, you know, a trade secret for a delicious patty right? A beef patty that has this special ingredient, and you figure out how to reverse engineer it or copy it, and then because you have money, you develop a local Ghanaian chain for this beef patty that's based on this other person's recipe. The other person may, in theory, have the registration for it, but if the person who owns this corporation and chain is in cahoots with the government and their boys, right, and their friends, do you think this person who actually went through the process to get it registered and own it is going to be successful against those who are in power? Right. So again, it goes back to the shift in the mind to understanding and respecting everyone in society, including those from the ground up. I don't disagree with the fact that, and I am so thankful for the work that Val, that you are doing with your organization to help move people from the informal sector to the formal sector, and to help create protections and protect them against those who seek to exploit them or undermine them. But that's, oh my goodness, that's like, I admire you for it, but it's got to be like pushing a boulder up a hill, right? And the more hands there are behind the boulder pushing it, the lighter the work is, the faster it can go and easier it can get to the top of the hill, but it's still work pushing a boulder up the top of the hill. What I would like to see us get to the point of is to destroy the boulder. It's to just like pulverize it and pound it into dust. So there is no boulder that's seeking to roll down the hill and crush all of these people at the bottom so that they can just walk freely up to the top of the hill and we can all roam around the hill. Now that's kind of pie in the sky. That's kind of, overall kind of dream. But if we're talking about the title of this panel in terms of Africa 2063 and these priorities and initiatives that we're aspiring to, these 7 aspirations, that is what we ought to be aspiring to. That those ought to be those goals that we are trying to get to, so that the work of my esteemed panelist Val can be easier and doesn't have to be focused on trying to push a boulder up a hill. Eliminate the boulder so that we can all walk up the hill, so that we can all hike up the hill and roam about it freely. And the folks at the top of the hill can come down in the valley, and the folks in the valley can get up to the top of the hill, and we can all enjoy it together. That's what I want to see us get to. How? I don't know. There's a lot of work to do, and that's more than we can solve in the few minutes that we may have left in this panel discussion, but that's where I want us to get to.
Let me chime in on that and say thank you. That's really, I like the way you talked about the boulder and pushing it up. It's not easy to incentivize survivalist SMEs as opposed to the opportunist ones to formalize, because there's a lack of trust. But one thing I've found, even the conference I had, the one we just had on Friday, were opportunist SMEs in the creative industry who are perceived, they have more than how many million followers, right? They're very, very famous. Nollywood, as you know, it's number 2 in Nigeria in terms of revenue. They're perceived as opportunists, but they too are going through, they have formalized, right? But they are overtaxed. So if you have more of them formalizing, the tax will go down because of large economies of scale. So the advantage, I had a meeting with 2 food, in the supply chain, some SMEs in the supply chain that have formalized. They are currently overtaxed because what happens, the few that have formalized, the government saps them of their last breath like a Dracula. And it's not unique to Nigeria. The government has to get money from somewhere to be able to.
What is the title of the subject? I'm not quite with them.
It's supposed to be the new.
So it makes sense to have, more people
of Africa. Okay. Sounds good.
The better. Right? Because
can then charge. Clifford, he just called me back, so he's working on his now.
Okay, sounds good.
Can you mute, please?
Okay.
Can you mute? I think we have a lot of people talking at the same time.
Okay.
So the whole point is, companies like Luscious Chocolate and Dundu Nation, these are like Nigerians owned, and even in Kenya, the whole of Africa, they have like SMEs now in the food supply chain that are formalizing. But the problem is that there's so few that the government is, when you're so few and few of you are paying taxes, the government has to get money from somewhere. But if more of them formalize with all the incentives we talked about earlier, providing them with, good health and safety environments to operate, giving, licensing fees, giving them trucks, especially for the food retailers, affordable energy, electricity and all that, then there's a way in which the government can spread out the sources of its, income and, generating revenue, and it will go down. Taxes will be much, so it's a mutual gain.
We're going to have to end here because we're definitely over time.
Yes. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for the audience and for everybody that participated. We appreciate the opportunity, and you should be able to receive a copy of our presentation, though you could not see it. I'm going to send it over to Dr. Focus so she'll be able to post it and make it available. So thank you, everybody. We hope you had some opportunity to get some questions answered, and look forward to any kind of follow-up that you have or information will be made available as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.